This is Elisa Cleary from the Global Learning Centre, sharing with you a resource to help you engage with reconciliation conversation starters for the globally engaged classroom and staff room. What I intend to do is to give you an overview of how to use this resource, to tell you what the purpose of reconciliation conversation starters might be for you and your students, how it aligns with relevant curriculum, the pedagogical approach we have used at the Global Learning Centre in this resource, and 4 reconciliation conversation starters that you could adapt for your classroom and or your staff room. I begin by acknowledging the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country, and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past and present, on the land in which this resource was created, the Turrbal people. The earliest historical records suggest that Brisbane was well inhabited by the Turrbal people. In fact, this dense inhabitation was one of the many reasons which attracted the early settlers to Meanjin, the Turrbal name for Brisbane, following their initial abortive settlement at Humpybong, now known as Redcliffe, in 1824. A warning: this presentation includes images and names of deceased people that may cause sadness or distress to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So the purpose of reconciliation conversation starters, firstly as a classroom resource. We have designed this so that it is an entry point into issues impacting on the lives of Indigenous Australians. We also hope that you can use this resource to connect local issues to the global context, and in so doing, nurture a global mindset. And thirdly, this resource helps you promote the development of alternative perspectives using Harvard University's visible thinking approach in your classroom, for whatever age you might be teaching and through whatever topic or discipline that you might be teaching. The other aspect of this resource is to assist with staff room professional development, to strengthen teacher knowledge and understanding about issues impacting on the lives of Indigenous Australians, to strengthen teacher capacity to explore teachable moments. We all have them when, out of the blue, a comment might be made and a discussion will start. With this resource, hopefully you're more ready to meet that discussion and to challenge thinking and extend your students' thinking. And finally, it can be used as a reflection tool for PLTs to consider where featured topics and strategies could be embedded into your curriculum. Now, reconciliation conversation starters aligns with all relevant curriculum. Beginning with your Australian curriculum, it has a wonderful fit with the cross-curriculum priority, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures. We've identified codes 1.2, 1.6 and 1.9 as particularly relevant to this resource. With 1.2, the idea is that you can look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and how these people maintain a special connection to and responsibility for country and place. 1.6 focuses on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples living in Australia and demonstrating resilience in responding to historic and contemporary impacts of colonisation. There's a particular fit with that code. And then the third, 1.9, when we look at present and past contributions of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples, locally, nationally and globally. The resource also fits well with the general capability of intercultural understanding, particularly the element of interacting and empathising with others. This is an important element of what this resource tries to achieve in our students. And in all learning areas, you can find a fit with what follows. The other aspect of curriculum is the QCAA's 21st Century Skills that are being used in the general senior syllabuses, particularly the skill of personal and social skills. The early years learning framework also aligns beautifully with this resource. and in particular the outcome of children connecting with and contributing to their world. And finally, My Time, Our Place. This framework is linked to the Early Years Learning Framework and focuses on children from birth to 5 years. The pedagogical approach we used in Reconciliation Conversation Starters is twofold. Firstly, we take on board the teachings, the philosophical, practical teachings in this particular resource delivered to us from UNESCO entitled Global Citizenship Education, Topics and Learning Objectives. There are 3 domains of learning associated with this resource, the first of which is the cognitive. And what this resource attempts to do, indeed does, is link our learners' skills of critical thinking and analysis with topics that have connection to the local, national and global context. And secondly, the domain of socio-emotional learning. In this resource, we endeavour to develop our students' attitudes of empathy, solidarity and respect for difference and diversity. And thirdly, what the resource does is deliver ways of engaging our students in an active way so that they are more willing to take on board the necessary actions to achieve more equity and more social cohesion for all people located in our society. Part B of our pedagogical approach, and features strongly through this resource, is the work done by Project Zero at Harvard University through the visible thinking approach, and you can see the website link there. This approach aims to deepen content learning and to cultivate students' thinking skills and thinking dispositions across all ages and subjects. And it does this by utilising very simple thinking routines that you can apply on a regular basis. The other two aspects to this particular approach, which don't feature in the resource, but I commend to you, include the documentation of student thinking. So you use the resources, you elicit thinking, you document that thinking, and then finally, through a very good process of reflective professional practice, Harvard supports you to deconstruct that thinking and to see where your students are at and how much more and where to go with that thinking to strengthen it and to refine it. So in this resource, we use, in fact, 11 different visible thinking routines. Just the tip of the iceberg, actually. When you go to the Visible Thinking Routines website, you will see many different routines that can be applied to elicit perspectives that engage children in creative thinking, in understanding more deeply, in truth-seeking, and that kind of thing which we all know we need if our children are to succeed professionally and personally in our globalised world. So, in closing in this section of our discussion, what you're going to find then in this resource are 4 case studies, each of which starts with an inquiry-based question. The first of which, how does the greatest show on earth connect us to the roots of injustice experienced by the Bookerman people, takes us to Palm Island off the coast of Townsville. And then we move into a question which relates to Mount Isa. How can the streets of Myanmar and Mount Isa help us better understand homelessness? And thirdly, who owns Indigenous artefacts? Our context for this question is Cairns and Canada. And finally, we look at the question of what is in a name? The rise and fall of Jim Crow from the USA to Rockhampton, locations that the Global Learning Centre has had the privilege, that is Queensland-based locations, we've had the privilege of visiting this year. Our first case study, how does the greatest show on earth connect us to the roots of injustice experienced by the Bookerman people, takes us to Palm Island off the coast of Townsville. Now you may wish to use this case study as a standalone resource or as a way into investigating the history of Palm Island. Palm Islanders are known as the Bookerman people. This means many tribes, one people. It's an acknowledgement that Palm Islanders share a history with over 40 different clans. And many of today's community members are descendants of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders forcibly removed to Palm Island from throughout Queensland. So we take this case study, firstly, to the global context as a way into a history that has much complexity and tragedy about it. And with this first routine, Think, Puzzle, Explore, and we often use this at the Global Learning Centre as an entry point into a topic, what we want to do is to engage our students in the topic that is to follow. We also want to know a little bit about what they might already know in terms of their knowledge of the topic, in terms of their attitudes and values and perceptions around the topic. And the way we do this in terms of engagement is by introducing the Greatest Show on Earth film. So the question starts in the routine Think, Puzzle, Explore. What do you think you know about the film Greatest Show on Earth? Now, it's been in the cinemas, or has been in the cinemas for some time now, and of course now online. So some of your students, depending on their ages, may already have some knowledge about this film. You may also wish to use the clip that you can see here on the slide, the poster of the Barnum and Bailey Circus promotion. In this instance, we're looking at a grand water circus tour. So you may wish to show your students that as a way of triggering some interest and some engagement. Then you can take them to the trailer. What questions or puzzles do you have? Now, you can see we have a link to the film trailer which lasts for 2 minutes and 23 seconds. And what you'll see there is Australia's Hugh Jackman, who features in the film, some words from him that reveal to us a contemporary take on the circus. And the film also has featuring in it a sign, Barnum's American Museum of Curiosity. So we see that word Barnum again. Once the film is finished and we've invited students to question or to come up with what their wonderings about the film, we then invite our students to consider what they want to know next. Now, at this point, you may wish to lead your students a little, particularly as you, the teacher, will know what is to follow. For example, you may wish to prompt your students with questions like, who are these people who became performers in this circus? Why were they who they were? Why would people find them curious at the time? Where did they come from? Let's go now to the next slide and see if we can learn a little bit more about the people who performed in this circus and how they're actually connected to Palm Island and the Bookerman people. Now, this image here will assist us in making those connections a little more without giving too much away. Quite a confronting poster. And we can learn, particularly if you're interested in taking this story further through the links at the end of this case study, more about this intriguing connection with Palm Island. With this image, commonly what we could do with our students is interrogate it using the routines claim, support, and question. We invite students to look at an image like this one and to make some suggestions about what might be going on in here, in this image, and to provide evidence of why we think so. So justifying our claims, but also recognising that we don't know the full story, so encouraging our students to ask some questions. You can see in the sign there, male and female Australian cannibals. A dreadful statement, promotion, when we now know that, of course, Australia was not inhabited by cannibals. However, The story is that this is what was used to promote a group of Australians who came from from Palm Island rather, and ended up with this circus, the Barnum Circus, all those years ago. Let's find out a little more. And here we have it, a photograph that connects us directly with the greatest show on earth. Our story now goes more deeply, and we use the routine perceive, know, and care about to try and walk in the shoes of one man who was recruited by a fellow called Cunningham, responsible for promoting the image that you saw on the previous slide to potential circus participants or attendees way back in the late 1800s. As it says in the text under the photograph here, August 1882, P.T. Barnum called for examples of all the uncivilized races in existence. Showman R.A. Cunningham shipped 2 groups of Australian Aborigines to the States. They came from Palm Island, and we don't really know the circumstances around which they went. But what we do know is that they were displayed as cannibals in the circus and also in dime museums, fairgrounds and other places around America and Europe. And we know that the gentleman circled in blue, Tambo, on that journey lasted just 12 months. He fell ill with pneumonia and died, and was unable to be buried in the ways of the people at that time of his group, which led to great suffering for them, and in fact was embalmed. And some years later, many years later, he was, in fact, in 1993, his body, his mummified body, was found in America, in Cleveland, Ohio, and was brought back, was repatriated back to Palm Island. Now, if we invite our students to walk in the shoes of Tambo at that time, and for them to feel about his situation as he embarked on the unknown, to go to the States and be part of this extraordinary situation, we could also invite our students, as it says in question 2, to consider what he might know about at that time or believe, and thirdly, what he might care about. Quite an extraordinary, tragic tale of displacement. And a link to this extraordinary film that these days has quite a different tone about it, but when we unpack the history, can connect the story of Palm globally, and also unveil another perspective on a very tragic piece of history connected to this island. You can, as I mentioned earlier, learn more about this tale and understand more deeply the detail of it. As I mentioned earlier, this story could stand alone as a point of study in your classroom to learn about displacement and how it can happen, did happen in different ways, and also as a way of then asking more questions. So what else happened on Palm? What happened following this particular tale? And the stories of those who came there against their wishes in the early 1900s. And we now know those people as the Bukhaman people. Case study 2. How can the streets of Myanmar and Mount Isa help us better understand homelessness? This case study is designed to assist you in engaging with the topic of homelessness, particularly homelessness and its impact on Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islanders. The case study takes us to Mount Isa, a township some 820 kilometres west of Townsville, and not that far from the Northern Territory border, and not that far from the Gulf of Carpentaria, some 350 kilometres south. Mount Isa is situated on the traditional lands of the Kalkadoon people, regarded as the elite Aboriginal warriors of Queensland. And at this point, we acknowledge that in 1884, over 200 of these people, the Kalkadoon, were massacred at Battle Mountain by settlers and police. So, in using this particular case study, we begin with a global approach to homelessness as an entry point into the location of Mount Isa. And we do that by taking our students to Myanmar. And we use the routine See, Think, Wonder. This is a fabulous routine to investigate any topic. It's a wonderful starting point because it engages us in a way to look closely at a resource, a film or a picture. We've got both happening here actually. And to really stop and think about what is presented to us and how that knowledge, our own knowledge, interacts with what we're seeing. So for example, here we have a film, Life as a Street Kid. It's one child's story, Thura's story. And you can watch this with your students, and you invite them to look closely and identify with what they see, to take a rather superficial look, not to do any interpreting of what they see, but to note particular features. For example, let's have a look at this this image here. An image of a street in Yangon, the same location, the same city in which the film takes place. And if I ask my students to tell me what they see, I would be expecting them to identify people, cars, buildings, that kind of thing. Then I would ask my students to tell me what they think is going on in the image or the film. And here I would ask them to go a little deeper with their observations, to interpret. For example, I might say something like, I can see lots of power lines, and I might suggest that perhaps things are not so regulated when it comes to planning and organising the city to keep it safe in times of storms when electrical wires go down. In the third question, what does the film make you wonder? And this is where we invite our students to infer something about the stimulus that they're looking at. For example, I might be wondering, and I'm looking at the topic of homelessness here, how many people might be homeless on that street? How often do those power lines work? And if not, what are some of the causes of that? It could be a myriad of wonderings, a myriad of thoughts, a myriad of observations. We just need, through this routine, to hatch open all of that so we can engage our students in what is going on. Now, when you watch the film about Thura, expect it will take about 2 minutes. And also, make sure you watch it first to ensure that it's an appropriate film for your students to watch. And one of the things that you learn about through his story is that it does touch upon topics like sniffing glue, that kind of thing. So be mindful of that in terms of the audience in which you intend on using this resource with. So we have our students engaged, we have them taking a global perspective. Now let's narrow in our next slide on our location that we want to emphasise, and that happens to be Mount Isa. So we take our story to Mount Isa, and here we are using a wonderful resource that has been created by Centacare and JETSAC about homelessness in Mount Isa. This resource contains 6 short films from 6 different perspectives, and it's through this routine circle of viewpoints that we have a look at this topic from different standpoints. And we do this using the sentence stems that you can see on the right here, where it invites you to brainstorm a list of different perspectives. For instance, you might invite your students to think about Mount Isa and say to them, look, who would be good to talk to learn more about this particular topic of homelessness? And then share the films and go back to that list and see who we might need to add to the list. And then from that point, make a selection. Decide, for example, you might want students to think about the topic of homelessness from the perspective of a young Indigenous person, in which case the film about Terry would be useful. Or it might be you want to look at the topic of homelessness from the perspective of somebody who provides support, a centre care worker like Chris. Now, once the perspective has been chosen, then we invite our students to describe what they think their viewpoint would be from that perspective. Students take on an actor's role. They go in character and they describe their thoughts about homelessness from that character's perspective. And then when they're done, we go back to the notion of questioning. What questions do you have as a young Indigenous man about this topic? What questions do you have as a team leader at Centacare about this topic? This enables your students to look at this particular issue from different angles and hopefully hear different ways of interpreting those different angles and perspectives. The third routine takes us a little further as we look more closely at what can be done to support particularly young people in Mount Isa who are homeless. The 2016 census reveals that more than 100,000 Australians were homeless at that time, and in Mount Isa the figure was 266. And we know that for Aboriginal Australians experiencing very high levels of homelessness, this means inadequate, inhospitable and insecure housing that without doubt impacts on health and social and community engagement. Through this routine, Connect, Extend and Challenge, we look at what can be done. We take an optimistic approach and we look at the possibilities of providing support and resolving this situation for young people afflicted with this terrible social ill. And we begin by looking at the question, how is the information in this picture presented in the image, connected to what you already know? Now, as educators, we understand that we live in a very visual society. Though the visuals are often fleeting, it's important that we encourage our students to really stop and look closely at what they're looking at, and to realise that images, of course, are manipulated to tell a story, and we have to go beyond the frame to question and to think more deeply about what we're seeing and to ask more questions and to go further in our investigations. For kids in Mount Isa who might be looking at this particular photo, they may already have some ideas that connect them to that particular image, such as the YPA acronym there. For others who are not in that location, there may be other aspects there that connect to prior knowledge, such as the notion of a youth shelter. The second question in this routine, what new ideas do you get that extend or push your thinking in new directions? It may well be that for your students or for your professional learning team, that you were unaware that youth shelters are available in regional towns. And thirdly, the next question, what is still challenging or confusing for you to get your mind around this particular issue? What questions do you now have about homelessness in Mount Isa? And hopefully there are lots more, because this is a conversation starter. This is hopefully generating engagement and questions to go deeper, to learn more, and in fact perhaps get in touch with the YPA and learn about what is being done to support the youth of Mount Isa, the Indigenous youth in particular, facing homelessness. And finally, here are some links to extend your knowledge and understanding of the issue of homelessness, not just, of course, an issue for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but for many others too. But in this particular case study, we take a particular look at the situation in Mount Isa, and these articles and sites here will hopefully take you to that next level of understanding this situation more deeply. Our third case study, Who Owns the Indigenous Artefacts from Canada to Cairns, provides us with a conversation starter about the contemporary and contentious issue of the repatriation of cultural artefacts. Our context is Cairns. Our global context is Canada. Now about Cairns. We're talking about a city located on the east coast of the Cape York Peninsula, between the Coral Sea and the Great Dividing Range. The traditional custodians of the Cairns area, the Gimuway Wallabara Yinji peoples and the Irukandji peoples, are located in one of the most beautiful parts of Queensland. Let's take ourselves now to the next slide. In order for us to investigate the issue of the repatriation of cultural artefacts, what we've done here is begun with a story located in Canada, the story of the return of the Gippsgalucks pole. And what this does, that is, taking a global context first before we look at the situation in Cairns, is open up a connection that is global in terms of the experience of many First Nations people who are endeavouring to find and bring home precious cultural property that was collected often through colonisation. And the way in which we do that with this particular story is watch the first 2.5 minutes of a lengthy and fascinating film situated in Canada, a film that traces the journey of the Haisla people who try to bring home a funerary pole, and successfully do so actually, to their British Columbia village from the Stockholm Museum. And when you watch this first 2.5 minutes, a very good routine to engage your students with is what makes you say that. So after watching the film, we ask, what do you think is going on in that film? And then, why, or rather, what do you see that makes you say that? So we're looking for interpretation of what was seen with justification, always finding opportunities to challenge our students to give reasons for why they think the way they do. So we take that big picture, that global look through this extraordinary story, and then we move to our next routine. Now with this routine, often the way we like to go about doing it is upfront, one of our early routines, so that we can develop some mystery and we can engage our students in a point of stimulus. In this case, it's a photograph of what would seem to be a necklace. You would present the photo to your students, maybe multiple copies, each copy situated on a poster sheet. Students in groups look at the picture and follow through this questioning sequence. What do they see? Very plainly, what do they see, without any interpretation or inference? Then secondly, what do you think about what you see? For example, I might say, I think they are shells, and I think that because they have a shiny pearl look about them, and I've seen that before in the ocean or at the beach. And thirdly, what do you wonder about what you see? For example, the question might be, where did that necklace come from? So in answering these three questions, we are now ready to go a little bit deeper. And perhaps if you have used this particular routine in sequence with the first, and your students have learnt a little bit about the Canadian story and the Haisla people and the return of the Gippsgalucks pole, they might be making some wonderings about perhaps whether this item was collected from some time ago and ended up in the hands of people who may like to keep it as an exhibition item. Let's find out. Okay, what we have here is a photograph of an item that was on display in Canberra during an exhibition of items that came from the British Museum to Canberra for an Australian audience to view. What you are looking at is the Nautilus shell necklace, a Yidinji people cultural artefact collected from the Cairns region in the very early 1900s, late 1800s, by a gentleman called Derwin Vallance. The quote there notes, "The shell, the ornaments, are believed to have magical presence. They are like diamonds or gold. It gives status and energy." The quote indicating the significance or importance of that particular necklace. Now you can see this photograph and a whole lot more by going to the Encounters Indigenous Cultures and Contact History Teaching resource at that website link to the National Museum of Australia. When the artefact came out here from the British Museum exhibition back in 2015-2016, items were photographed and then returned to the British Museum, and this photograph was one of those. That is a necklace, and a fantastic teaching resource was constructed for you to access online. Please take the time to look at it. We have included items from it here, including the photograph. Moving on with our story here though, we can see in the image on the right an image of the peacemaker, the King of Cairns, an influential community leader, Iine, taken in 1905, and in his hair, perhaps, he is wearing something like the necklace, a headband, a shell headband. We're going to learn a little bit more about him in the next slide. Our third routine. Now, what we did in this case study of Cairns connected to Canada is provide you with two routines. We felt that they were both very important tools for taking a look at this complex and contentious issue around the repatriation of cultural artefacts. Now, here, now, there, then routine provides you with an opportunity to encourage your students to consider past perspectives with present perspectives, to develop an understanding of how our thinking can change over time and across cultures, to help us understand that we can have strong stances in controversial issues, and that our stances are influenced by our social and historical context. It's a way of uncovering also stereotypical perceptions, as well as attitudes which might be ethnocentric and consist of presentist judgments, judgments that don't engage with the full picture, the historical chronology or cultural context. And the way in which we can do that with this particular topic is to take a look at a film identified there in the green box. Iine's great-granddaughter, Henrietta Marie, born at Yungabar, just outside Cairns, provides us with a wonderful investigation of the meaning of objects like the Nautilus shell necklace. When you watch this film, Henrietta invites us to consider who was or who were the people at that time who collected these objects from her ancestors, from people perhaps like her great-grandfather. What were they thinking when they did it? What was important to them? The orange box gives us a little glimpse into perhaps what those thoughts might have been. We know a little bit about the Englishman Derwin Vallance, who collected the necklace and some 90 objects from the Cairns region. We know that he paid the equivalent of a month's wages for them which was significant money at that time. Today, of course, to pay a month's wages for an object such as the necklace would also be significant for many people. We know that he said to his sister in a letter, "Do display them well, as they are a very fine collection." Now, having watched Henrietta, if you make time for that, you consider the perspective of the Englishman, you can then undertake these 5 questions through the routine here, now, there, then. The quote, "What did it mean to them as to what it means to us?" are the words of Henrietta in the film. From these words, we can then list 2 columns. In column A, consider our thoughts today about collecting property from Indigenous people. What do we know today? What are the present stances to do with this particular activity of collecting? In the second question, we consider past positions, past stances about collecting property from the Indigenous people. And here we can invite our students to be time travellers, perhaps to walk in the shoes of Derwent Vallance. Once both columns are complete, we can compare past and present perspectives. And in the fourth question, we can think about, well, what's changed? Why do people in the past not think the way we do today? And finally, we can investigate further. We can invite our students to find out more about the way people thought back then, to develop a deeper appreciation and understanding of what was actually perhaps going on and how that compares with our perspectives today. Now, the other routine that we've coupled with here, now, there, then is our next routine. Oh, one thing, here we have an example of how here, now, there, then can look like in practice. And this is an example of one of the other fantastic resources on the website Visible Thinking, pz.org. In this instance, what they show you is some work done by upper primary, early secondary students about the institution of marriage and how our values and judgments about that particular topic have changed and why this may be so. So you can take a look at that website and do look at the pictures of practice in case you're wondering how these routines can look in reality in a classroom. But moving on now to part B of our third routine, a tug-of-war routine. And here we have an opportunity to test our knowledge and understanding and perspectives in the classroom, and to invite our students to come to a position that has been considered and can be justified through the question, is it fair for the British Museum to keep the Nautilus shell necklace? Now, in this particular question, there's a very important word, and that is the word fair. We are tackling this question from a values position, and that is one of fairness and human rights. If you wish to know more about that particular value, an important asset to this particular routine is to take a look at the Declaration of Human Rights and to understand something of what it means to take property and what we know about the universal understandings around what it means to do that, and the rightness or otherwise of that. In this particular slide, we can see we've provided our students with possibly 2 quotes. The one in blue is anonymous, and the one in green, we return to the words of Henrietta Mari. In the first instance, the position is that art treasures, like the beautiful Nautilus necklace, should be accessible to the greatest number of people and to scholars, and in practice this means retaining them in the great museums of the world, like the British Museum. That is one perspective. The second in green, though, challenges us to think from another perspective. When Henrietta says, "I and most Aboriginal people acknowledge that if it were not for museums and other such institutions, even less of our cultural property would exist in Australia today. For that we are grateful, But the fact remains that this property was collected when Aboriginal people were under extreme duress, with governments and missions committed to the methodic and systematic destruction of our cultures and our traditions under extreme colonial policies. So what she reveals is something of the complexity of this issue. There are no easy answers, and let's have a look at the next slide. Here we have a demonstration of practice when this routine is used with Year 2 and Year 3 students on the topic of playing computer games. Is this better than playing games outside? So you can try this routine with very young children. In this instance, the teacher has scribed for the children and provided each of their responses to the question. What you don't see is another slide where we have students who are the maybes. And of course, that's a good place for our students to be, to realise that this is no simple discussion. It's not black and white, that there are questions and there are contexts too that can vary our response to our controversial questions. The thing to remember though, in answering a question like, is it fair for the British Museum to keep the Nautilus shell necklace, that we have tugs, that is, ideas on the side of the yes and the no, and we place those arguments up and we ask the what if questions. What if, for example, you might say to your students that there are people in England who really want to see the Nautilus necklace, but also don't feel comfortable seeing it in the British Museum. Where would we sit then in our response to the question if that was the context? The important aspect too about this particular routine is that your students share their thinking, that they see there are different ways to see this particular topic. And that's important, that we can all have different points of view and we can all change too in our perspective on things. An additional tool with this particular routine is to actually use a rope, so that each time a tug is placed on a continuum, we move the rope in one direction or the other, so that we can see how our discussion can ebb and flow. And we can invite our students also to come back to the routine once it's done, to see if they might change their mind in one way or another once they hear the perspectives of their peers. So there you have, in fact, 4 routines for that particular case study. In the next slide, you have some links that take you on a deeper investigation of this highly contentious, very important topic of the repatriation of cultural property and artefacts to Indigenous peoples here in Australia and abroad. Our 4th case study, What is in a Name? The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow from the United States to Rockhampton. This case study provides you with a conversation starter that explores notions of reconciliation to do with reconciling places and people. Yes, we take a journey to America, and then we find our way back to one of the oldest cities in Queensland, Rockhampton, founded in 1853, situated on the lands of the Darumbal people, and first recognised as traditional owners on the 21st of June 2016 after a 23-year legal battle. The determination area of the land, now recognised as the home of the Darumbal people, is some 2,500 square kilometres in and around Rockhampton, Yeppoon and Marlborough. But let's begin our case study in the States with our first routine, engaging our students through Think, Puzzle, Explore, engaging and also tapping into what they possibly already know or think they already know about the topic of segregation and Jim Crow, the Jim Crow laws. This particular film, some 3 minutes and 57 seconds, is an overview of the segregation laws that were prominent in the southern part of America that enforced racial segregation in the South between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s. And just a little background, Jim Crow was the name of a minstrel routine, actually a jumping Jim Crow, performed in 1828 and by many other imitators, including the actor Joseph Jefferson. The term Jim Crow then came to be a derogatory epithet for African Americans and a designation for their segregated life. So as students watch the film, after you have invited them to offer up their thoughts about what they think it might be about, after they've watched it, invite them to come up with some questions or puzzles that they might have. Now, if they are students located in Rockhampton or the region surrounding, they may have already recognised the name Jim Crow because it happens to be the name of a local mountain. If the students have no knowledge of this, their questions, of course, may be various and about all sorts of other things. All of the questions and puzzles we welcome at this point of our investigation. The next question, what does the film make you want to explore? Hopefully, what you'll have after watching this extraordinary snapshot of America's relatively recent history, they'll want to know more. How on earth, for instance, is it possible that just outside Rockhampton we have a mountain called Jim Crow? Let's go a little deeper in our conversation. Now we can do that by providing our students with this image here, an image of a sign displaying Mount Jim Crow National Park and a warning that climbing it is unsafe. Also on this slide, we have a quote from the member for Keppel, Brittany Lorger, a quote that appeared in the Morning Bulletin on the 22nd of February 2017. But before we get to that, we need to watch a clip featuring Darumbal elders Auntie Sally and Auntie Nikki, who explain their need to have Mount Jim Crow and nearby Mount Wheeler renamed to their original Darumbal names. The clip reveals that the elders would like to see this change so that there is a more accurate acknowledgement of the region's cultural and historical past, which predates European inhabitation. What, though, the member for Keppel does, the Honourable Brittany Lorger, she provides an additional perspective on why the mountain should lose its name. She says to reach reconciliation, to truly reach it, we must first be honest about our past. And I think that the fact that Mount Jim Crow, a place of significant cultural heritage to our traditional owners, by its name refers to racism and segregation, is a great shame. What Brittany is doing is linking or making that connection that could be felt by many in the area, particularly those aware of the American history to do with the Jim Crow racial segregation laws, to think about a very deep reason for changing this name to do with our most important reconciling with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. In the next slide, we can see here how we can then invite our students to consider this name change through the lens of fairness. The routine Making It Fair Now, Then and Later works like this. We provide our students with a question, the question you can see in the box there. What could be done to acknowledge the pre-colonial past of the mountain and a legacy of shame felt by members of the community? This question is one that invites all sorts of possibilities, including the possibilities that some students may come up with that a name change is not what they think is appropriate. If that is the case, what we can do to guide our conversation is to include values of fairness and justice, as the routine suggests. We ask students to brainstorm ideas for things they might do to make it fair. We then sort the list into actions that relate to perhaps making the situation fair in the past, now, or for the future. Then students select one idea they think has the most merit and expand on it, either verbally or in writing. So provide a justification for their perspective. And it may well be that they may come back to their ideas as we pursue, or as you choose to pursue this conversation starter in more detail. It might well be that they could come up with all sorts of compromises too. For example, that both names are retained and included on a marker, a signage for the site. Let's see where we can go next in the third routine. Here we have a photograph indicating actually what has now happened, and very recently so. The sign to Mount Jim Crow in this image was removed just before its formal name change on the 18th of May 2018. And in looking at this particular routine, we can use this routine in all sorts of ways, either at the start of a unit of work, or of course in this instance at the end of a conversation. And what we do is ask our students to reflect upon the topic, and that is the changing of the names of places, what they once might have thought about this topic. Get them to share their ideas as a group, or perhaps firstly in an individual reflection, then as a group, and then to think about what they now think about the topic. What is their position now? What might have changed, and why might their thoughts have changed? Particularly as we now know that Mount Jim Crow no longer is known as Mount Jim Crow, it is now Bagar. The end of a story that has come full circle at a time when the people of Central Queensland, the traditional owners, the Darumbal people, have finally been recognised as the traditional owners some 23 years after the commencement of a land rights legal claim. In our final slide, here are some extra links for you to learn about the Darumbal people, the landmark native title decision that took place on the 22nd of June, and then the topic of returning iconic landmarks to their original names. Some very interesting stories there in relevant news outlets. These are just conversation starters, very worthy ones that could take you on a most important investigation of reconciliation between Australia's First Peoples and those of us who have come to this land to make it their home.